So I'm Zenda Ofir. I'm a South African natural scientist and evaluator. I'm currently based in Geneva in Switzerland, but South Africa is my home. It's where my heart is. It's where my family is. It's where my head is. My forefathers came from France, fleeing religious persecution in the 1690s. On my mother's side, on my father's side, they came from Scotland in the 1800s. So I'm one of the white tribe of South Africa that's called Afrikaners. I've been working internationally for 20 years. And it's really nice for me to share some of the understandings that I got in working across many different cultures over the years, in my own country, of course, and in Africa and Asia, which are the two continents that I focus on. So in 2007, at the 4th African Evaluation Conference in Niamey in Niger, my very good colleague and friend Suli Gariba from Ghana and I organized a special day-long session in which we challenged African evaluators. We said, what would evaluation have looked like if it was invented in Africa rather than in North America? That's now evaluation as we know it. Of course, evaluation originated long ago, 2,000 years ago or more, in China through examinations. But modern evaluation as we know it comes from North America. So when I lived for a few months in Japan a whole lot of years ago, some of the professors I worked with at Hiroshima University told me that evaluation as practiced in the West will never work for them because of the vast difference in thinking and in being that come from philosophies like Confucianism and Buddhism. So a very obvious, very simplistic example is the widely held idea that in East and Southeast Asia, saving face is a very accepted concept, right? We all know that also in the West. And it's a complex matter that is actually deeply rooted in Confucian culture. As a simple example, reporting bad news about one's performance bears a personal risk of losing face. That has implications for how we do evaluation if we were in East Asia. In a very well-known study by Richard Nesbitt in 2003 between East Asians, especially Chinese and Americans, he noted that when describing themselves, East Asians tend to make reference to social roles much more than Americans do. They focus more on self-improvement, where Americans focus on feeling good about themselves. Maintaining harmonious social relationships takes precedence over achieving personal success in East Asia. And rhetoric and argumentation are much less prominent in Asian life due to a stronger focus on group harmony. So this is one of the reasons why behavior and negotiations in the West tend to be more confrontational and aggressive very often in diplomacy and in negotiations than in East or Southeast Asia. Chinese also were proven to focus more on context. So they tend to attribute behavior to situational factors, while Americans focus more on attributing the same behavior to the person and her personal dispositions. This means that interpretations of causality will differ quite a lot between people in East Asia and in especially Anglophone the West. So all of this have implications for our theories of change, for evaluation questions, for evaluation processes, and for the formulation of findings and recommendations. And it's interesting to think about how the things that I mentioned will play out differently in how we do things and even how we develop our theories in evaluation. So my first challenge to African evaluators: what are the philosophies, the ways of being and the ways of thinking, not just the traditions and some of the things that we do on a daily basis, but how are our ways of thinking, our knowledge systems, our beings different in different African societies that should help shape how evaluation on the continent should be done, thinking of some of the examples that I've mentioned and others. So it is, of course, about, as we say in Southern Africa, about Ubuntu and relations, but there's more to it, and African evaluators can bring this to the fore. My second challenge to African evaluators relates to stories or to narratives in professional terms. Remember, the stories and narratives we hear or tell ourselves shape our perceptions, our actions, our patterns in societies. So dominant stories or dominant narratives, the stories we hear most frequently, are very important. So I want to make 2 points about dominant stories or narratives and why this is extremely important for African evaluators and people who commission evaluations. Number one, what stories or narratives about ourselves as Africans do we buy into? You know the TED talks. The Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie did a TED talk in 2009. You can find it on YouTube. It's already got listeners more than 22 million since 2009. She talks about the power of the single story. And she reminds us how impressionable we are in the face of a story, especially different versions of the same story and of a simple story told over and over again. It makes us form stereotypes, right? It makes us form impressions of people, of a country. That's why people often talk about soft power, because dominant narratives about how wonderful one society is really does create a mental picture in one's mind about that society. Now, Chimamanda reminds us beautifully of a single story told about Africa by outsiders, one of catastrophe, of poverty, of ignorance. And she then says how they are told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person or that society or that country or that part of the world. Do take time to listen to that TED talk. It's very rich for us as evaluators. But my question to us as evaluators in Africa is, are we proud and confident enough to reflect Africa in our work? Are we proud enough of our African story and stories, the narratives that we tell ourselves about ourselves? Are we proud and confident enough about them so that we can tell them as evaluators and craft evaluation theory and practices on those? Do we know enough about the depth of African philosophy to infuse our evaluation practice with it in appropriate ways? Can we develop African evaluation theories and practices that are not derived in some or other way from the West? I've actually not yet seen one, but You can tell me about them. Bagele Chalisa, who is, of course, a driving force in this area, she has given us, I'm sure you know this, three things. One is really taking from the West. One is blending in ways that serves both African and Western ways of thinking. And then those who are really rooted in Africa. And I also wrote blogs about rooting Evaluation Africa and also leading from evaluation from Africa. And so these are things we really need to think about. Leopold Senghor, who was the first president of Senegal, said, first and foremost, you need to embrace your own roots before opening up to others. And then you can take from others what will improve your own. So my second point about narratives and stories is, what stories or narratives about development and therefore of evaluation do we buy into? Evaluation in our part of the world tends to follow the trends of development. So development models influence how we think and what we evaluate and how we evaluate. So one of the most dominant narratives in development has been the neoliberal narratives about how countries develop. And many of you know that that is really wreaked havoc on many African economies. I wonder if evaluators foresaw this, the negative consequences of the dominant narrative of neoliberal policies. So we have to deal with the colonization of the mind that have influenced many African intellectuals and even evaluators, people who are well educated, especially elsewhere outside the continent. We often talk in our forums about ownership and contextualization, and yes, the intent is very good. But do we really succeed in that? Does it happen? And do evaluators evaluate not only our own practices, but do we evaluate development from the perspective that we must not automatically just buy into a dominant narrative about how change happens or about how development happens? In Western evaluation, in evaluation practice, we often have an unquestioning acceptance of Western narratives that dominate our mental models around development, around assessment, about evaluation, about change. It's not bad. We just need to have a critical perspective on it and not just accept it unquestioningly. There's a lot of value in all of this. I'm not shooting them down, but let's be critical and bring our own to the table. So Mervyn Claxton of Trinidad and Tobago, who used to be an official in UNESCO, wrote about a decade ago, any model of development that ignores, marginalizes, or rejects the society's indigenous culture is unlikely to be successful. And Jeremy Lent, in his famous book, The Patterning Instinct, said, the distinctive values and beliefs about human nature that form the bedrock of Western thought are silently assumed to be those that drive people from all over the world and throughout history. Celestine Monga, who's a Cameroonian who until recently was with the African Development Bank, said, it is strange for economists to rigidly and mechanically apply methods and tools designed for capital-intensive Switzerland to capital-poor, labor-intensive Burundi. So do we know what are the values and worldviews that should underlie Africa's development or our own societies or communities' development in each of our countries and in their development strategies? What will be our story about development and how to evaluate it in a way that serves Africa? So there are two examples. China's exceptionally successful effort to escape from its poverty traps over the past 4 years has not followed any conventional model of economic development. Instead, as experts have shown, it is the best illustration of adaptive management and experimentation and improvisation and of complexity principles and systems work long before these became buzzwords in global development. They've practiced it forever and very effectively in the last 40 years. Some years ago, a study by the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, as a second example, did a study aimed at understanding whether the dominant models used for building state capacity in 8 fragile countries were fit for purpose. Planners and implementers overlooked the overcoming of it found that the same mistakes have persisted over decades, despite the billions of dollars being poured into capacity development. Planners and implementers have overlooked the implications of shortcomings in the dominant approaches to capacity development, and so have evaluators. Too much training, too little attention to power and politics, the neglect of alternative capacities outside Western notions of capacity, and a focus on individuals and organizations rather than on the system as a whole and how its parts interact. So the study says, the aid industry turns fundamentally political processes of social and institutional change into projects, which are in turn cloaked in value-neutral technocracy, don't know how to pronounce that exactly, technocracy, focusing on limited equipment or resources, insufficient knowledge, weak coordination, poor monitoring, and so on, rather than about power, incentives, and interests. I doubt whether many evaluations have highlighted these serious limitations in the billions of dollars we spend every year in the global south on capacity development. Tyson Yunkaporta is an extremely impressive indigenous Maori voice from Aotearoa, New Zealand. In his truly remarkable book, Sand Talk, it's sitting here behind me, he demonstrates how well aligned indigenous wisdom is with current understandings of global systems, of the interaction with nature, the holistic nature of the universe and everything that's on planet Earth, of the relationships between people and nature, and how far contemporary life is removed from the pattern of creation. He points out how important it is to find different stories, different narratives, different concepts, and ways of looking at things if we wish to save the world. He reminds us our family stories will outlast the stories of this civilization, but at the moment they are most invisible in the shadow of monolithic grand narratives like progress, grounded in the myth of primitivism. That's what he says in his book. Now, some years ago, I wrote a series of blog posts about Made in Africa evaluation, and I included my own framework that I called Navigating the Intersection Between Culture and Evaluation, NICE, which is a nice acronym. And I noted there are at least 10 areas where we can focus our research and practice in Made in Africa evaluation. Among others, what is the meaning of the term evaluation in indigenous languages? How are these reflected in the proverbs that we use? How does that relate to evaluation? Whose idea of failure or progress or success counts? And do these terms have different meanings in Africa, in different African societies? What does progress actually mean? How do African societies' concepts of knowledge, truth, and evidence differ from others, if at all? Or our understanding of self, of our relationships with nature, with the cosmos around us, the universe in which we live. What is different about social relationships in Africa, or in the purpose of interaction and communication and how we do it? The stories, storytelling, right? How different is it from others, and why, and what does it mean for evaluation? Let's look deeply. How do African societies understand the idea of change, or of causality, or of judgment? And so on. I wrote some blog posts about it. So I look forward to the work, all the work that African evaluators are doing, and will still contribute with pride and knowledge, telling our own stories about evaluation, about development of our continent. We will craft new narratives about development and about evaluation, one that will best serve Africa and the world. Because we'll be all joining, and we are joining, a whole global community of evaluators, thousands, many of whom have done more, like in Maori society or in many other indigenous societies, some in the East, some in Africa, many in Africa, almost all in Africa. White people are very few in Africa, and everybody is indigenous otherwise. And also, of course, in parts of Latin America, usually minorities, but sometimes also majorities, and around the world in North America. As one of my friends say, Glenn Page, say, north of north, not just global south. We have many indigenous societies and African Americans who have done wonderful work in this area. And also, of course, people from the West. We're all one global community. And it's in our diversity, in our differences, that we find the richness that can serve our world well through evaluation and how we think about development. I look forward to what we all will still do in this regard that will really move our practice forward.